So for the past 6 months, I have lived here in Hong Kong, which in my eyes is one of the more fascinating geopolitical entities on the globe right now. The territory was taken by the British from the Chinese in 1842, and it operated as a British colony until 1997, at which time the British and the Chinese signed a 50-year agreement which would slowly reincorporate it back into the city, over which time it would be more or less independent. But as China has taken more and more control, especially in the past 10 years, an interesting dialectic has emerged between the city's eastern roots and traditional values and its newer Western ideals of democracy and freedom of speech and of the press. The conflict arising from this contradiction has led to massive civil unrest and tension between the city and China. Learning about Chinese history and how it's taught in the West versus the East, I mean, Hong Kong is a sort of Western city anyways, but you get the idea, has forced me to question my preconceived notions of everything from Tiananmen Square to Mao's Cultural Revolution to the 2019 mass protests. But the one thing that has grabbed my attention more than anything lately has been the topic of this video. Now, I think if you polled an average American population and asked them who has more propaganda between the US and China, the overwhelming majority would say China. And from a Western perspective, it's easy to see why. For one, Chinese propaganda is sort of obvious and often state-produced. It's clear for us in the West, for instance, how the crackdown of 2019 protests has been justified by the government under the guise of national security and stability. I actually saw this in action at the Hong Kong Museum of History, whose only exhibit right now is a celebration of the 2022 national security law. If you know anything about recent Chinese history, you'll know that that is somewhat of a touchy subject. More recently, you had DeepSeek delivering the same messages when prompted with questions about Hong Kong or Taiwan as the government. They've grown more sophisticated in recent years, but in many ways, they're playing catch-up. But greater than any of this is the fact that America, through its own system of propaganda, has successfully demonized China and indoctrinated our citizens into a pro-capitalist, neoliberal, US hegemonic, and American exceptionalist ideology. How's that for a lot of buzzwords? The subtlety of American propaganda is its strength, and its operation by objective media outlets lends it credibility. Whereas the Chinese government suppresses and censors, our big tech corporations and mass media conglomerates censor and suppress. While sovereign power reigns in China, Westerners live under the power of freedom and success that sells us our own exploitation. Some dissidence is permitted in the West to feed this illusion, but such discourse is kept at the fringes. As we've seen time and again, should any real threat to the status quo emerge, it will never last long. In Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's revolutionary dissection of mass media propaganda, manufacturing consent, they introduced the media as, quote, serving to mobilize support for the special interests that dominate the state and private activity, and spend the book tearing down the widely held, quote, democratic postulate that the media are independent and committed to discovering and reporting the truth, and that they do not merely reflect the world as powerful groups wish it to be perceived. Chomsky and Herman present a 5-filtered propaganda model, filters which prop up a media ecology that is focused on profit over education and systematically suppresses views dissident to state and corporate-approved messaging. As we proceed, please keep in mind that this entire media landscape is a symptom of larger problems with the capitalist system, problems that are exacerbated by new media, the internet and social media, which did not exist at the time of manufacturing consent's writing. To me, there's no better modern example to prove Chomsky and Herman's thesis than the media's treatment of Israel. To borrow from Chomsky's sarcastic turn of phrase, the Israelis are worthy victims, meaning Israel is a US client state, and the Palestinians are unworthy victims. As such, the media has massively skewed in support of Israel's actions, claiming its right to self-defense and by and large repeating state-determined language to overemphasize the October 7th Hamas attack.
I think that it is without any question our imperative to do what we can to allow Israel to defend itself against those kinds of attacks.
With the help of fellow creator Ben from the channel Dummy, I will dissect how an ecological approach to media can help us understand the powers at play and the best ways to fight back. I'll attempt to give some systemic and individual solutions to combating propaganda and explain how I have become a more informed citizen. By the way, keep in mind that I wrote this all before Trump announced his plan to do another ethnic cleansing of Palestine. In fact, very little that I say here is specific to Trump, and that's kind of the point. This isn't really about a liberal or conservative bias. This is really to provide the framework for you to go off and examine the media that you consume in your own way. So yeah, I think without further ado, let's get into the 5 filters of the propaganda model. The media landscape is dominated by massive corporations and conglomerates. This knowledge is so commonplace that it only needs a passing mention. But since 1986, when manufacturing consent was written, consolidation across all industries, not just media, has ballooned to comical levels, boosted by the deregulation of neoliberal economic policies and likely to increase with Trump 2.0. In 2011, just 6 corporations controlled 90% of all traditional media outlets. Let that sink in. Karl Marx says that this monopolization of industry is the inevitable end result of capitalism, and if we apply a bit of critical thinking, we can understand this to be true. As much as capitalists like to parrot propaganda about laissez-faire economics and free markets, they are, in practice, impossible. When a company like Amazon gets big enough, they achieve economies of scale that make it impossible for local companies or producers to compete. They slash prices and force competitors out of the market through either acquisition or collapse, all the while exploiting their underpaid and overworked labor, who realistically have no better option because the entire system does the same thing to them. They union bust, lobby Congress, invade customer privacy, and essentially do whatever the fuck they want because there is nobody left that can compete with them, and Congress is in their pocket. The consequences of monopoly capitalism become even more insidious when applied to media conglomerates, who have power over our very minds and thought.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets are true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 This viral clip from 7 years ago compiles programs from several local news networks owned and operated by Sinclair Broadcast Group. Sinclair has an obvious right-wing agenda represented by this pro-Trump script on fake news, which they required local anchors to deliver. These scripted programs are sent to local stations in addition to what they call must-run segments, which include commentary from people like former Trump advisor Boris Epshteyn, and daily reports from what they call the Terrorism Alert Desk, which, let's be real, is just thinly veiled Islamophobia.
And what was perhaps even weirder about that chainsaw segment was the story that closed it out.
And mayors in 22 French towns are ignoring a high court's ruling that says banning burkinis is illegal. More than 30 towns initially outlawed the swimwear worn mostly by Muslim women. From the Terrorism Alert Desk, I'm Michelle Marsh.
What the fuck?
Local news networks like the ones Sinclair operates are still trusted news sources for many Americans, who know the news anchors' faces and trust them implicitly. But most people don't know that their favorite local station is owned by media conglomerates like Sinclair and Nexstar, who manipulate the messages we receive and abuse their power and trust to further their political agendas. I singled out Sinclair here, but by and large this is an industry and society-wide issue, because, this just in, these corporations don't care about delivering you accurate information. They are after profit. Duh. An ecological approach to media literacy means being aware not just of the content of a given medium, but of the medium itself. thinking about media as environments that are interrelated rather than isolated.
We're often taught to think about content, check your sources, research the author, like verify information, but we're not taught to think about form or medium. So for example, if you're looking at a television program, how is that television program funded? How is it distributed? Who got to make it? This really quickly gets into like critical theory as well, is that like you're able to look at like the actual like investors who are behind it and the social and political system that allowed this particular medium to flourish. So in a nutshell, what I think the ecological approach offers there is that instead of just analyzing individual pieces of media, you can create a more broad and robust toolkit to look at types of media, and then individual pieces of content within them are all more comprehensible. You have a better understanding of television programs if you understand how the television industry works, for example.
As Lance Straight puts it, quote, "A medium is not an actor. It is a stage on which human agents play their parts. As environments, media do not determine our actions, but they define the range of possible actions we can take and facilitate certain actions while discouraging others." This is where the sponsor of this video, Ground News, comes in. As someone who cares about media literacy, Ground News is often the first place I go to get a high-level picture of a story. For instance, let's look at this story about a report from Oxfam, an anti-poverty group, which predicted that we will see 5 trillionaires in the next decade. Now, the first thing I want to highlight here is the ownership tool. As you can see, 22% of the sources are independent, which is well above average. Next, 51% of the sources lean left. Of these, I can see several socialist or socialist-leaning sources. And look at who you don't see. No New York Times, no Washington Post, no LA Times. All this information on its own can tell you a lot. From here, I try to read the stories from 2 or more sources of opposing perspectives. For this one, let's look at Common Dreams, a socialist news outlet, and Associated Press, the most mainstream American outlet I could find. I immediately see that Common Dreams emphasizes monopoly power and inherited wealth, which is what is meant by the report's title, Takers Not Makers. But in AP, none of this is even mentioned, and it instead focuses on Trump's inauguration? Weird. Ground News is a goldmine for these kinds of insights, and it also just allows you to see stories you wouldn't otherwise. As someone who likes to keep his ear to the ground on what the other side is saying, I find their blind spot feed particularly useful, which shows stories being over or underreported from either side of the political spectrum. You can check the link in my description for 40% off their Vantage subscription, or 15% off any other subscription option. Your subscription helps support transparency in news, and it also helps support my channel, so thank you in advance. All right, back to me. The customer is king. That's how the old adage goes. Well, in ad-based media, the advertisers are the customer, and you, the consumer, are the product. Specifically on the internet, your data is the product. I think everybody knows this, but it's important to understanding this next filter. This fact is top of mind for anyone looking to make a career on YouTube one day. If you want to get brand deals, for instance, you better conform to what the advertisers want, aka nothing too controversial. In essence, this is not the type of video that's friendly to mainstream advertisers, because it critiques the very way that they and I make money. But wait, you might be saying, didn't I just do an ad break? Well, yes, I'm glad you noticed, because that was intentional. Maybe this is too meta, so bear with me here. I did this to show how someone like myself, who is constantly critical of capitalism, still relies on it, and in fact, my content is necessarily shaped by it. Let's go back to media ecology to understand what I mean. Here's Ben giving an analogy from Lance Straight's paper.
When someone asks us what happens in a game of billiards, we're likely to talk about the turns that the players took, the movement of the balls on the table, their collisions with each other, who won the game, details of the actual game itself. We could consider this the content of a game of billiards. But a media ecologist may ask you instead to focus on the table that the games are played on. The table has a certain shape. and the pockets are in a certain location, and these details inform the rules and what turns the players might take and in what order. In this way, the structure of the table changes the content of every game of billiards.
Similarly, the form of a medium, in this case a YouTube video, shapes its contents. The rules and regulations shape what I'm allowed to say. The advertising guidelines shape how I can express my message. The community guidelines shape what comments you are allowed to post. The desire for sponsorship integrations shape what type of videos I make. The algorithm shapes how I structure my intro, my title, my thumbnail. Every single video on this platform is beholden to the rules and limitations of the medium, and true media literacy is understanding this fact.
Everything, down to like what you write, where and when, is touched by the funding model, is touched by approval of the platform. It's undeniable that we all operate differently than we would if there were an actual competitive ecosystem for video sharing, you know?
So in a cruel but ultimately vindicating sense of irony, it looks like this video is going to be demonetized, or at least have limited monetization. I'm not really sure. But anyways, very frustrating, and also kind of proves the point that I'm making here. So if you want to support content like this, the best way to do that is either becoming a paid subscriber of my Substack or signing up to the sponsor, Ground News. Anyways, just thought that was kind of funny and wanted to share. All right, back to the video. And let's be clear, this is hardly limited to YouTube. Chomsky and Herman write, quote, "Large corporate advertisers on television will rarely sponsor programs that engage in serious criticisms of corporate activities, such as the problem of environmental degradation, the workings of the military-industrial complex, or corporate support of and benefits from third-world tyrannies." An example they give is the public television station WNET, who lost its corporate funding from Gulf and Western in 1985 after the station showed a documentary called Hungry for Profit, which contains material critical of multinational corporate activities in the Third World. Even before the program was shown, in anticipation of the negative corporate reaction, station officials, quote, "did all we could to get the program sanitized," according to one station source. The chief executive of Gulf and Western complained to the station that the program was, quote, "virulently anti-business, if not anti-American, and that the stations carrying the program was not a behavior of a friend of the corporation." The London Economist says that most people believe that WNET would not make the same mistake again. This is disturbing, but it's rarely discussed on any large scale because of the self-perpetuating nature. I mean, who's going to call out these issues? Politicians who are bought by the 1%? Mass media who rely on advertising revenue for their livelihood? No. The only way is for us, the people, to talk with one another. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I guess I'm more talking at you, but you can leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Technology is a good tool, keyword, tool, not a solution, and has been instrumental in unveiling the truth in what's going on in Palestine, for instance. But ultimately, for the reasons I pointed out above and that I'll expand on a bit later, it's unreliable. Essentially, what the advertising focus and the profit orientation of the mass media results in is shallow content that's meant to appease us, but never really challenge us. To break out of this cycle takes hard work, persistence, motivation, and deprogramming. It's not easy. People from developing nations perhaps are more easily able to see through the facade, but as a white American born with the inherent privilege that comes with it, I have found it easy to look past anything that might challenge my views, until recently, I suppose. So I would strongly encourage you, whoever you are and wherever you live, to go outside of your comfort zone. Read ideas you disagree with, experience places you've never been, challenge your internalized prejudices, and inspect the media that you consume. See where it comes from, who pays for it, what their agenda is. All of these are important questions in understanding the media landscape, because unbiased media, like it or not, just doesn't exist. That includes me, by the way. You probably can tell what my biases are. So our job as consumers is to know what those biases are and where they come from. Got it? Okay, video over. Just kidding. One One of the key ways that the media manufactures consent for Israel's genocidal project is through the disproportionate use of Israeli sources. A 2006 study from scholars Kwang Kuo Chang and Jerry Alumit Zeldez found that 3 out of every 4 major U.S. newspapers consistently favor Israeli sources over Palestinians, accord Israeli officials more positive media coverage, and avoid quoting Palestinian officials. This is readily apparent in the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, a war criminal, is consistently given prominent airtime on major U.S. networks, and often not challenged on his insane policies. Can you imagine any Hamas leader being given that same treatment? This blatant bias in sourcing is intentional. In November of 2023, David Lindsay, the Senior Director of News Standards and Practices for CNN, issued a directive effectively barring the reporting of most Hamas statements, characterizing them as inflammatory rhetoric and propaganda. He wrote, quote, "Most of it has been said many times before and is not newsworthy. We should be careful not to give it a platform." In contrast, one CNN staffer noted that the network repeatedly aired inflammatory rhetoric and propaganda from Israeli officials and American supporters, often without challenge in interviews. Ta-Nehisi Coates, promoting his new book The Message in an interview with CBS News, was bombarded with loaded questions from co-anchor Tony Dokupil.
I imagine if I took your name out of it, took away the awards and the acclaim, took the cover off the book, the publishing house goes away, the content of that section would not be out of place in the backpack of an extremist. And so then I found myself wondering, why does Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I've known for a long time, read his work for a long time, very talented, smart guy, leave out so much? Why leave out that Israel is surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it? Why leave out that Israel deals with terror groups that want to eliminate it? Why not detail anything of the first and the second intifada, the cafe bombings, the bus bombings, the little kids blown to bits? And is it because you just don't believe that Israel, in any condition, has a right to exist?
Coates handled the question remarkably well, turning Dokupil's claim of bias on its head and questioning why this perspective is so underrepresented, and why Israel apologists aren't subject to the same level of scrutiny.
Well, I would say the perspective that you just outlined, there is no shortage of that perspective in American media. That's the first thing I would say. I am most concerned always with those who don't have a voice, with those who don't have the ability to talk. I have asked repeatedly in my interviews whether there is a single network, mainstream organization in America with a Palestinian American bureau chief or correspondent who actually has a voice to articulate their part of the world. I've been a reporter for 20 years. The reporters of those who believe more sympathetically about Israel and its right to exist don't have a problem getting their voice out. But what I saw in Palestine, what I saw on the West Bank, what I saw in Haifa in Israel, what I saw in the South Hebron Hills, those were the stories that I have not heard.
It's also hilarious that Dokupil claimed that Coates' book didn't provide appropriate context. Come on, bro. Contextual understanding of history is sorely missing in the coverage of the October 7th Hamas attack and the subsequent coverage of Israelis' disproportionate and genocidal response. So let's take some time to review. Gotta be careful. I fell out of this the other day. Are these crickets loud? I had to crack a brew in preemptive response to the comments that I know this video is going to generate. So, cheers to my haters. The great myth of Israel is that it was founded on a land without people for a people without land. Any informed person can see through this bullshit, but in case you don't believe me, take it from the first Prime Minister of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. Let us not ignore the truth among ourselves. Politically, we are the aggressors, and they defend themselves. The country is theirs because they inhabit it. Whereas we want to come here and settle down, and in their view, we want to take away from them their country. Comrade David Ben-Gurion? Just kidding. There's a very interesting history prior to the formation of the Israeli state and the role of the British Empire in it, for which I'd recommend the podcast series Thaura from The Dig, but for the sake of concision, I'll start in 1948 with the Nakba. I'll just hit some highlights because you truly don't need much to understand how one-sided the violence has been. So Nakba translates in English as catastrophe, and that's what it was for the Palestinian people. Over the course of Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestine, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, and over 500 villages were destroyed or depopulated. Israeli soldiers terrorized Palestinians into fleeing or fighting through massacres, rapes, psychological warfare, and poisoning of water supply. Palestinian society was decimated, its arts and books destroyed, and the subsequent 70 years was a continuation of Israel's efforts to rid their newly claimed lands from its indigenous residents. Not only did 78% of former Palestine become the State of Israel, but the lands that became the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were occupied by the Israeli military. To this day, settlers in the West Bank forcibly grab more land wherever they can, and Palestinians are subject to apartheid, widely considered more violent and oppressive than South Africa's former apartheid. This includes a separate criminal justice system with discriminatory laws used to dispossess them of land and property, separate roads which contain checkpoints at which arbitrary violence is inflicted on them, denial of rights to equal nationality and status, forced separation from their families, and deprivation of adequate economic and social rights like garbage collection, electricity, and public transit. Palestinians are systematically subjected to home demolitions and forced evictions and live in constant fear of losing their homes. This is all pre-2023, by the way. Now, some might be watching this and saying, what about Hamas? What about their terror, their brutality? Well, let me explain something to you about Hamas. Hamas, and Hezbollah, by the way, exist because the US and Israel forced it into existence. Their armed resistance strategies exist because any attempt at peaceful resolution or protest or diplomacy have been spat on by the US and Israel. In 1993 and 95, Israel and Palestine signed the Oslo Accords, in which the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, recognized Israel as a state and conceded 78% of its historical lands to Israel. These conditions drew controversy from both sides, inciting attacks from Israeli far-right extremists and from Hamas. The PLO had accepted these controversial conditions because it was supposed to mean an end to the military occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, but of course that didn't happen. Israel continued its occupations and continued to expand its illegal settlements, thanks in part to Netanyahu's election to his first term in 1996, and Palestinian self-determination was rejected. The result was the Second Intifada in 2000. Then in 2006, when Hamas came into political power through democratic elections, which were determined to be free and fair by the international community, they tried to create Palestinian unity and accepted major conditions by agreeing to the 1967 borders and a two-state solution. Still, Israel and the U.S. refused to even consider entering negotiations until Palestine recognized the State of Israel, renounced armed resistance, and accepted the conditions of the Oslo Accords, which, by the way, Israel had never upheld. Do you see the double standard here? Israel and the U.S. put forth these demands that are supposed to be done on the negotiation table. Why would Palestine accept these conditions to even enter negotiations? It makes no fucking sense. Instead of negotiating, the international community staged a coup by backing the other major political party who favored negotiations with Israel, Fatah, financially, militarily, and diplomatically. The years from 2006 to present saw continual enforcement of apartheid and expansion of Jewish settlements, a blockade of the Gaza Strip, which resulted in severe shortages of housing, drinking water, electricity, essential medicines and medical care, food, educational equipment, and building materials. And over 50% of Gaza's population living below the poverty line. Any attempts at peace, such as Hamas enforcing a Palestinian ceasefire from 2012 to 2014, were disregarded by Israel. In fact, after this, Israel intensified its atrocities. with 2014 seeing the highest number of civilian casualties since 1967. Then, in 2018, largely peaceful protests at the Gaza-Israel border were brutally repressed, with Israeli forces killing 214 and injuring over 8,000. These policies and atrocities continue to this day, as we're all well aware.
The broader context is one in which, with Hamas effectively being contained, Israeli apartheid is becoming more vicious and becoming more acceptable internationally and regionally.
Now, I'm not bringing this up to defend the October 7th attack of Hamas, which killed 767 and by all accounts was horrifying. Absolutely. However, this larger context of the entire history of Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which Trump and Netanyahu are planning to continue. Don't know what that's going to look like. Not going to be good. All of this context is incredibly important to understand why many Palestinians feel that violence is the only solution they have left. Tarek Bakoni, author of The Age of Coexistence, writes, quote, Hamas's use of violence, like the PLO before it, has been rooted in arguments of legitimacy, justice, and self-defense. Given Israel's violent occupation of Palestinian land, arms were seen as the only recourse for resistance. Decades of failed diplomacy have done little to undermine this argument. Yet there is no question that Hamas's reliance on jihad had devastating implications for the Palestinian people. Aside from the moral bankruptcy and corrosive effect of targeting and killing civilians, dedication to armed resistance against a superb foe like Israel has led to the disintegration of the Palestinian struggle. Strategically, this approach has not only failed, it has also threatened to erode the very social fabric of the Palestinian community under occupation. Israel understands the self-defeating nature of Hamas's strategy. It's why they had, until October 7th, been financially propping up the organization since its inception. First as a strategy to undermine secular organizations like the PLO, and in the past 15 years as a strategy, as Netanyahu says, to thwart the establishment of the Palestinian state. The October 7th attacks were Israel's excuse to exterminate the Palestinian people. Their genocide is the culmination of a decades-long effort to solve the Palestinian problem once and for all. Sound familiar? Their atrocities were and are broadcast in HD for all the world to see. And despite the massive backlash from regular people, it didn't stop the flow of weapons for 15 months and over 50,000, likely in the hundreds of thousands of confirmed deaths. Though Israel failed in its immediate objective, now is definitely not the time to lose focus of this issue. As we've seen, the negotiation, the ceasefire that Trump coordinated was clearly planned in advance, and he's only planning to do something much more horrifying in the coming 4 years, and it's up to us to try and stop it. How we do that, I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. What I do know is that until Palestine is granted the right of self-determination, these atrocities are only going to continue. The cycle is going to repeat over and over again. And as much as Trump would like the problem to go away to Jordan and Egypt, that's not going to happen. We've seen the resilience of Palestinians over the last year and a half, and good luck. We've already seen Israel break the ceasefire in Gaza, and the military activities in the West Bank have only intensified under the guise of rooting out terrorists. For those of you that have the financial means, I'll leave some links in the description for places you can donate to that will help with the rebuilding efforts in Gaza and also provide humanitarian aid, which is much needed. Okay, Flak and the Inforcers. All right. So initially I had a lengthy section here about all the people who have gotten fired or severed ties with their media institution on some bullshit, essentially, for supporting Israel. And I'll leave the headlines up on screen here. I'll also link the stories below if you want to read more about it. But I think that Ben actually brings up the more interesting point, which I'd like to spend this section interrogating, because this video is already hella long. Flak, very simply, refers to negative responses to a media statement or opinion.
Flak is like really effective. Flak, if you fear saying something because of the repercussions, the like social repercussions to your reputation, to your legitimacy as a journalist or as a citizen, or a risk of losing your job or some other material injury, or really any other repercussion that is external to the media institution, you're just not going to speak. And it's a little more invisible in that way, because it's hard to tell. It's hard to see when Flak has driven someone from an institution because they are then not present in it, you know?
Hey, it's me, the guy of the video that you're watching. I just wanted to jump in and say, if you're enjoying these little snippets with Ben, we had a great conversation. Shout out to Ben. You can find the full interview on the Stories We Tell podcast feed. So I don't know if you knew that, but there is a podcast. I haven't really promoted it because it's been kind of fallen by the wayside. But there's going to be a lot of new content, different stuff than you see on the YouTube channel. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, go check it out. All right, back to the video. So this is a kind of self-censorship, you could say, and it permeates new media as well. I'll give a recent example. Are you guys familiar with Luigi Mangione? Hot topic, isn't it? Haven't really heard much from him lately. Well, in the aftermath of this incident, this alleged murder of a United Healthcare CEO, several claims of DMCA takedown surfaced. What this means is there was some kind of a copyright infringement. It applied mostly to YouTube and online merch, but what I want to focus on is this channel, Sisyphus55, pretty big channel, you may know it. He made a video about Luigi Mangione. I never watched it because he took it down like the very next day, and he posted this to his YouTube community page in response. Quote, I was the one who decided to remove it after learning about a disturbing trend of DMCA takedowns targeting creators and artists discussing the UHC situation. While there are several examples of large creators discussing the topic on YouTube, and while I did not believe that the video was necessarily problematic, I did not want to take the risk as the strikes appear to be aggressive and random. He explains that any strike on his channel, which has over 1 million subscribers, would be detrimental to his income and livelihood. So I want to be clear that I am in no way judging the decision. I just think it's very an interesting manifestation of Flak. This is how Flak manifests. We are terrified of doing something seen as wrong and having all of our hard work flushed down the drain. What this means in practice is that people are not talking about important issues. YouTube creators are implicitly encouraged to make content that is neutral and inoffensive and entertaining, but not really anything thought-provoking, as an effort to please the algorithm and please the advertisers. I don't know if everybody realizes that they do this. It's not everybody, obviously. There's people doing really good work on YouTube, but it's really kept at the fringes. You know, it's not getting Mr. Beast numbers. And some might say that, well, this is just what people want to see. And I highly disagree with that notion. I think that people don't know what they want. I think Martin Scorsese said once about Marvel movies or something, that if people only know one thing, they're only going to want that one thing. I'll be honest with y'all, this has been a major ethical concern of mine since the outset of this channel. I didn't really expect to grow this quickly, but now that I am monetized, I already see the ways that monetization and advertising can influence your content without you even knowing it. Ben touched on this a little bit.
I'm very fortunate in like my current financial position where I have like, you know, a real person job as well. And I do YouTube as a hobby, that I take the stance that I will never accept a sponsor. Like I just don't want to do it. Maybe that feeling will change in many years, but I've gotten offers in my inbox that I'm like, I know if I take this, I'm gonna write differently, because I already write differently knowing like how the platform functions.
You know, I tell myself that if it got to the point that I was censoring myself, I wouldn't want to continue with this, and maybe that's true, but I also only have 14,000 subscribers. Maybe once I get to 100,000, or once this is my full-time career, my outlook might change, and I might be more willing to capitulate to what the algorithm wants. I don't know. It's something to think about. For me, probably more than you. But anyways, let's move on to the fifth filter. The original fifth and final filter in manufacturing consent was anti-communism as a control mechanism. But as Noam Chomsky said in a 2019 interview, this was too narrow. Put simply, this can be thought of as fear-mongering by way of a common enemy. A favorite of power seekers from Hitler and the Jews to Cold War America and the Soviets, to post-9/11 America and terrorists, to Reagan and drugs/crime, to Trump and immigrants, trans people, and pretty much everyone that's not a straight white man. Our media institutions have largely fallen in line with these tactics, and the result has been deep-seated racism, sexism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, anti-socialist sentiments, etc. The tragic irony of Israel's decades-long colonial violence against Palestinians is that it's the Jewish state, home to one of the most persecuted groups in human history, that is turning around and inflicting their inherited trauma onto Palestinians. American and Israeli leaders know full well the power that the memory of the Holocaust has over us. They weaponize it and desecrate its memory with statements such as Netanyahu's baseless claim that Hitler didn't have the idea for the extermination of the Jews until the Palestinian Grand Mufti told him.
Hitler didn't want to exterminate the Jews at the time, he wanted to expel the Jews. And Haj Amin al-Husseini went to Hitler and said, if you expel them, they'll all come here. So what should I do with them? He asked. He said, burn them.
They use the very real and growing threat of anti-Semitism as a defense for their colonial Zionism, branding anyone who criticizes Israel as an anti-Semite.
The way that we talk about anti-Semitism isn't about protecting Jews, it's about protecting Israel. How dangerous is that at this moment with the rise of anti-Semitism?
And let's not forget the use of common enemies such as Hamas and Hezbollah, which have been instrumental in the media's manufacture of consent for Israel's genocide. In 2003, The Intercept ran a report that unequivocally shows how newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times used the words slaughter, horrific, and massacre far more frequently when describing Israelis versus Palestinians. Over this time frame, by the way, the Israelis killed, I think, around 15,000 Palestinians compared to the 1,200 killed on October 7th by Hamas. And this doesn't even mention the fact that terrorism, apartheid, or genocide are almost never used to describe Israel's actions, which one other Intercept report noted was intentional. The Intercept also noted the lack of coverage of children and journalist deaths, despite there being clear evidence that Israel has targeted them specifically. By way of comparison, more Palestinian children died in the first week of the Gaza bombing than during the first year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yet these papers ran multiple personal, sympathetic stories highlighting the plight of children during the first 6 weeks of the Ukraine war. And what's the difference between Ukraine and Palestine? That's right, Ukraine is a NATO member, so they are worthy victims. These decisions result from journalistic standards and best practices, which are often given with specific directive from on high. Another Intercept report highlighted a leaked New York Times memo, which applied strict guidelines around words like ethnic cleansing, genocide, and occupied territories. It's why you never see news sources call it what it is, how it's been designated by the UN, Amnesty International, and the ICC. CNN employs even more repressive and apologetic language in describing the situation. Editor-in-Chief and CEO Mark Thompson sent a memo to reporters instructing them to, quote, Continue always to remind our audiences of the immediate cause of this current conflict, namely the Hamas attack and mass murder and kidnap of civilians. One CNN staffer said that its coverage of the war amounts to, quote, journalistic malpractice. If you want a really good breakdown of exactly how institutions like the New York Times manufacture consent for genocide and the language tricks that they use, my boy Christian posted this to his Substack back on October 7th of 2024, and I don't think I realized, but I think it may have planted the seeds for what this video turned into. So go check it out. It's a really good piece. He also helped with various stages of the process. Also, my friend Timmy was instrumental. He helped me out with the script for this video, so thank you to him.
This inhuman system of exploitation will change, but only if we force it to change, and force it together.
The purpose of the propaganda model is to write the history of the victors, or more accurately, the oppressors. It's to placate us, the masses, who often don't have time or energy to cut through all the bullshit. We are overworked, underpaid, and the system is so effective because it understands that most people will just take a headline at face value. And remember, Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model is all about mass media. It's just one prong of an incredibly sophisticated propaganda system, which touches everything from film to TV to video games to, of course, the internet. Don't have time for all that right now. You can check out my video on the Sympathizer for more about films, though. But people are starting to see through the facade. Say what you will about Trump, but a big reason that he was successful is that he called out a problem that everybody can see, that our country is being run by ultra-wealthy elites, what he called the deep state, and that your government and the media is lying to you.
You are fake news.
Of course, people don't really seem to mind his hypocrisy of lining his cabinet with billionaires, but we don't need to get into that. It's become a bit of a cliche to blame everything on capitalism, but just because it's a cliche doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. You don't have to agree with Marx or Lenin if you don't want to. But their critiques of the economy, of how capitalism inevitably morphs into monopoly capitalism and imperialism, hold true today. The economic order is crumbling all around us, and I think that almost every social upheaval over the past, at least few decades can be tied back into this underlying problem. It's a symptom of the relentless growth drive of capitalism. That line needs to go up because, wait, why does the line need to go up?
If you want something better, you have like a certain human dignity that I and many others believe gives you the right to fight for it. And even in that difficulty, I think there's a lot of beauty, and I think that people should work towards that.
As Albert Camus says in The Myth of Sisyphus, the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart.
The way things change is because lots of people are working all the time. And, they're working in their communities, in their workplace, or wherever they happen to be, and they're building up the basis for popular movements which are going to make changes. That's the way everything has ever happened in history.
Those of us who want change, who want to live in a brighter future, often try to change the world too quickly. What I mean by this is changing the world, so to speak, might be the wrong way of looking at it. The world has changed, and it can't go back to how it was. Really, we should be trying to change with it. In the words of Lao Tzu, the world is a sacred vessel which cannot be changed. He who changes it will destroy it. He who seizes it will lose it. In Vita Contemplativa, philosopher and social critic Byung-Chul Han criticizes the very concept of human action. He says, quote, "The Anthropocene is the result of the total submission of nature to human action. Nature loses all independence and dignity. It is reduced to a part of, an appendix to, human history. We make history by acting, and now we make nature by dissolving it into the context created by human action. The Anthropocene marks the precise moment that nature is completely absorbed into and exploited by human action." Does he think that we should do nothing then to stem the tide of catastrophe? No, he's not delusional. Quote, But if the cause of the impending disaster is the view that what is absolutely fundamental is human action, action that has ruthlessly appropriated and exploited nature, then we require a corrective to human action itself. We must therefore increase the proportion of action that is contemplative, that is, to ensure that action is enriched by reflection. What does this mean in practice? It means less frenzied activity and more thoughtful engagement. It means less hatred and more organizing. It means truly educating yourself, or intellectual self-defense, as Noam Chomsky calls it.
Even if you're not working like on a specific project or towards a specific goal, just the pursuit of greater personal education is deeply empowering, not just for you, but for your community. And I think that the value of that can never be overstated. I think that is one of the most fundamentally human goods that we can create.
My thing lately has been learning about philosophy and spirituality and theory and pretty much everything you see on this channel, film analysis, that sort of thing. And Ben says that understanding media theory is essential because it gives you the tools to
see through the deceit in which they're ensnared.
If you want to get better at media literacy or develop media literacy for yourself, it's not going to come from just like pounding back headlines and like reading the news all the time. The news is always going to be going. It's always going to be happening. You can set it down for a bit. It's okay. It doesn't make you a bad citizen or an unengaged citizen. Whatever time you would spend on the news for a few months, spend it on, reading a book of media theory or of, learning how to read a scientific journal article or teaching yourself a new skill like data analysis or something like that,
So I would just say that whatever you feel passionate about at the moment, follow it and learn about whatever you want to.
I always tell my students, follow your bliss.
Follow your bliss?
Your bliss, where the deep sense of being in form and going where your body and the soul want to go. When you have that feeling, then stay with it and don't let anyone throw you off.
Getting back to news specifically, I think that you don't need to really reject mainstream journalism completely. I think that leads to its own problems, but you should be examining it with a skeptical eye. But I think the best thing that you can do, what I don't think enough people are doing, is reading independent media. I'll leave a few of my favorite sources up on screen here. So I kept this video very narrow by focusing on the case study of Israel and Palestine, and I did that intentionally because I think that makes things a little bit more tangible. But in doing this, I left out a lot about our internalized beliefs and our conditioning and indoctrination, and I would encourage you to use this video as a jumping off point to look into other things that are of interest to you and see how they are influenced by power and money, and use the media ecology approach, even if you're not looking at media. Just look at things holistically, I think, is the message that I'm trying to send. So, this video has been a lot. I think it's a good time to do a mindful pause. For those that are new, I like to give some time at the end of my videos to just sit and observe our thoughts and give ourselves a moment of rest because we need it. So whatever you're doing, just start by taking a few deep breaths in and out, and keep that going. And when I hit pause, you can do the same and just sit with whatever you're feeling at the moment for however long you want. Okay, you can allow your breathing to return to normal. And I'll be pausing in 3, 2, 1. Okay. If you came up with anything good in that mindful pause, drop it down in the comments if you're open to sharing, or just keep it to yourself. Otherwise, you can find my writing on Substack. Been posting some heat lately. I'm doing a read-along of the Tao Te Ching, and just got some other miscellaneous stuff. Had one about Kendrick's Super Bowl halftime show, which I thought turned out pretty good. Remember to check out the sponsor of this video, Ground News, for an easy way to start improving your media literacy. Check out the podcast feed for the full interview with Ben if you'd like. In case you missed it, also, I just launched a Discord server, so come say hi on there. We talk about film, books, politics, philosophy, that sort of thing. Pretty much everything you see on this channel. And that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching. Peace and love, free Palestine, and I'll see you next time.